So Roundtable 2 is caring for those left behind. I just want to start with kind of like sharing a story very similar to what we have discussed, but just to see the diversity of feelings across the country. About 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I was in Oklahoma City promoting a book, one of the book over there, along with Dr. Jing Nguyen over there. And after our presentation, I was sitting there trying to close things, you know, signing books and whatnot, and a lady came up to me. She was probably in her 50s, came up to me and sat right next to me and attentively asked me the question, why are our older generations doing the things that they are doing? What are they doing? What are they trying to accomplish? What are they trying to achieve? It doesn't make any sense to me what they are doing. She's referring to the activism, the cause, and the activities that they have been doing in the communities, Oklahoma communities, where they have approximately 16,000 folks. And I think this roundtable fits that really well in terms of questioning, but also answering part of, or explaining at least the efforts of those of the older generations, of the things that they care deeply about, particularly regarding the wounded RVN soldiers and widows who remained back in Vietnam, who didn't get the same opportunities to come to America or to come to other countries as we are here today in this room, as well as those who died during war or in re-education camps, but were never found, still lost, right? The effort to account for them, to find their remains, to bring them home, to bring closure to their families and to them, as well as the Amerasian children still left in Vietnam, as well as those who were born during the war and suffering through the different discriminations and treatments under their times in Vietnam, as well as in America when they arrive here in America, as they have to adjust to a different life. And so today's panel will focus on those issues as ways for us to understand efforts by the older generations in addressing some of these issues, for them to have a platform to discuss with us what they have been doing, for us in this younger generation to have a better understanding of what means to them, what motivate their work. Many of them, as I'm introducing to you guys today, we are privileged to have Miss Nguyen Thanh Thuy. She was born in 1943. You can see her profiles. Was in re-education camp for 13 years, came here in the 1990s via the HO program, HO 12, worked to support her family, then become an activist become the president of the Associations of Former Prisoners to Assist Disabled Veterans and Widows of the Republic of Vietnam. Mr. Nguyen Dat Thanh, who was born in 1943, was in prison for 9 years and 5 months, and came to America via the HO program in 1990, have dedicated the last 25 years of his life to try to account for Vietnamese remains lost during the war, as well as in re-education camps, as well as Dr. Sabrina Thomas, who works on the issues of Amerasian. She's my colleague at Texas Tech University. And then lastly, Dr. Andrew Wells Dung, who leads the Vietnam War Legacy and Reconciliation Initiative at the United States Institute of Peace. And so I would like to begin today with First, Ms. Nguyễn Thanh Thủy, and then followed by Mr. Nguyễn Đạt Thành, and then Sabrina and Andrew. Ms. Thanh Thủy and Mr. Nguyễn Đạt Thành, their presentation will be in Vietnamese, which I have translated up here. So for those who don't follow in Vietnamese, you can follow by reading the English translation. And so they will begin with their presentation. Each of them will have 10 minutes, all right? Mời cô Thủy.
Kính chào các hội thảo viên. Tôi là Nguyễn Thanh Thủy, Hội trưởng Hội HO, Cứu trợ Thương phế binh và Quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa. Rất hân hạnh được tham dự chung với các bạn trong chương trình hội thảo do Đại học Oregon tổ chức. Trước hết, xin cho tôi được nêu 2 trường hợp tiêu biểu mà tôi đã chứng kiến. Trường hợp thứ nhất là hình ảnh một thương phế binh gặp ở trong trại tù Z30D, Hàm Tân, Thuận Hải. Nguyên là một cựu nhân viên của chánh quyền Việt Nam Cộng Hòa. Tuy bị cụt một chân tới Hán mà vẫn phải ra làm lao động, một tay chống nạn và một tay thì dùng cái xẻng đó, cái xẻng rồi đào gốc buông cùng với các tù nhân khác. Sau khi ra tù, đó là trường hợp thứ hai, tới năm 1988 là chúng tôi phải đi kiếm sống, thì bán ở ngoài lề đường ở tại Sài Gòn trong 4 năm. Thì tôi chứng kiến một cảnh là một thương phế binh mù 2 mắt, hai chân luôn, tới Hán luôn, và phải ngồi trên một cái mò tàu cao, rồi 2 cái tay thì dùng xỏ vô 2 chiếc cuốc, thì dưới chiếc cuốc đó thì đóng một cái lốp cao su bánh xe đó để cho cái chiếc cuốc không có mòn. Thì lê lết đi ăn xin với một đứa bé gái chừng 9-10 tuổi. Đó là những đi xin mà giữa số đông người để kiếm sống. Đó là thật là thê thảm mà tôi thấy lúc ra ngoài xã hội lúc đó. Cho đến cuối năm 1992 thì tôi đến Mỹ theo diện HO 12, vừa phải lo cuộc sống cho gia đình và cũng phải tìm hiểu về cái đất tự do này để mà cho con cái học hành, thì cũng vừa phải lo cho gia đình ở bên Việt Nam vì còn mẹ và một đứa em thương phế binh có vợ và 2 con. Mãi đến năm 2003 thì tôi mới được có một chút thời giờ thông thả, nên đã tham gia hoạt động với tư cách là thiện nguyện viên với Hội HO Thương phế binh, Cứu trợ và Quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa. Thì lúc đó chúng tôi biết là cái hội chưa có được biết nhiều, là tại vì còn trong một cái hội nhỏ. Thì do đó cái vấn đề mà thương phế binh gửi hồ sơ rất là hạn chế. Là thứ nhất không biết địa chỉ, thứ hai là có cái khó khăn là bưu điện ở bên đó thấy gửi bằng PO Box đó là họ tìm cách khó khăn. Mà nếu đề ở ngoài cái chữ là Hội HO Thương phế binh nữa thì càng bị giữ lại, họ không chịu gửi. Do đó cho đến năm 2006 thì bắt đầu mới có Đại nhạc hội 1. Thì nhờ khi đó có Đại nhạc hội 1 thì bắt đầu là được người ta biết tới nhiều và phát triển, cho nên thương phế binh mới có biết cái địa chỉ để mà gửi. Đó, thì có những cách chúng tôi biết thì chúng tôi chỉ gửi giống như là mình gửi lậu, gọi là không có đề PO Box, nhưng mà ngoài không có đề địa chỉ của thương phế binh, đề địa chỉ thường thôi, nhưng mà trong đó là hồ sơ của thương phế binh. Đó là những cách mà hội khi mà đã phổ biến được rồi đó. Từ đó thì hội tiếp nhận càng ngày càng nhiều hồ sơ thương phế binh, và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa xin giúp đỡ với số lượng cao nhất là trên 17.000 hồ sơ thương phế binh mà chúng tôi có liên lạc được đó, và trên 6.000 quả phụ. Rồi 2 năm 2020 với 2021 là do bị ảnh hưởng cái Covid-19 á, thì rất nhiều thương phế binh và quả phụ đã qua đời, khiến số người mà liên lạc được xuống thấp. Thì thương phế binh còn trên là 10.000, hiện thời 10.000 thương phế binh và khoảng chừng 3.500 quả phụ. Chúng tôi có thể liên lạc được. Còn hiện nay thì Hội Thương phế binh và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa đã gửi về Việt Nam để trợ giúp thương phế binh theo ở mức độ. Thứ nhất là nặng thì là gồm mù 2 mắt, cụt 2 tay, cụt 2 chân. 2 là vừa, đó là gồm cụt 1 tay, cụt 1 chân, mù 1 mắt. Và nhẹ thì gồm cụt 1 tay, cụt mấy ngón tay hoặc là ngón chân. Đó là số tiền trợ cấp đó, tùy theo thương tật là 200, 100 và 50 đồng. Và tùy theo ngân khoản hội có nhiều thì gửi mỗi năm 1 lần, và ít thì lâu hơn, có thể là 1 năm rưỡi hoặc 2 năm. Phần giúp quả phụ là 50 đồng kể từ năm 2020. Trước là 100 đồng, nhưng mà sau đó vì cái Covid nên giảm. Thì đối với thương phế binh phải vào bệnh viện, một người được giúp 1 lần là 300 đồng. Và nếu qua đời thì giúp 200 đồng để làm hậu sự. Thì cơ sở dịch vụ gửi tiền ở Mỹ thì có nhân viên ở Việt Nam để trao thẳng Mỹ Kim cho thương phế binh và quả phụ. Người nhận thì ký tên biên nhận, và dịch vụ gửi hồi báo cho hội. Thời gian có Covid phải giao bằng tiền hồ của Việt Nam xã hội chủ nghĩa. Việc trợ giúp thương phế binh và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa ở Việt Nam là do sự ủng hộ đầy tình nghĩa và nhân từ của gia đình các bị xúc động. Thì việc mà gửi tiền và ủng hộ đầy tình nghĩa và nhân ái của gia đình các cụ quân gắn chánh và đồng hương hải ngoại đóng góp do những lần quyên góp, và hoàn toàn chưa hề được chính phủ, được chính quyền Hoa Kỳ quan tâm. Đó là lời mà chúng tôi từ lúc mà có Đại nhạc hội tới bây giờ đó. Đó là tất cả đều là do sự đóng góp của tất cả các gia đình, anh chị em mà đồng hương hải ngoại là giúp với các cụ quân cánh chính. Đó là trường hợp từ trước. Đó là tôi muốn nhấn mạnh ở đây để kêu gọi. Trong khi đó, tại quê hương Việt Nam, các thương phế binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa thường xuyên bị phân biệt đối xử, nghi kỵ, đàn áp, hăm dọa, nhất là tại các vùng xa xôi ở những tỉnh như là Quảng Nam, Quảng Ngãi, Thừa Thiên. Ở miền Trung, công an địa phương không ngừng gây khó dễ với thương phế binh khi họ nhận tiền từ nước ngoài. Chính quyền Việt Nam đã dẹp các chương trình giúp đỡ thương phế binh của dòng Chúa Cứu Thế và tại thành phố Hồ Chí Minh, và cũng như là đã dẹp cái vườn rau Lộc Hưng, tức là nơi mà thương phế binh ở đông. Tới bây giờ họ cũng tản mát chứ không có nơi cư trú. Phần lớn các thương phế binh nay đã cao tuổi, thuộc lớp 70, 80 hay 90, với thời gian còn lại không còn bao nhiêu, nên họ rất cần sự hỗ trợ của những cơ quan bác ái, nhân đạo và chính quyền Hoa Kỳ cũng của thế giới, kể cả Liên Hiệp Quốc, lưu tâm giúp đỡ để trong những ngày cuối đời họ được một chút an ủi với bữa cơm no, đủ đạm bạc và một mái nhà lành lặn để tránh mưa, và có chính đáng là họ xét ra họ có được một chút tiền để khi đau ốm có thể là lo được trong lúc mà ngặt nghèo. Những ước mơ sống nhỏ nhoi nhưng chính đáng của họ xét ra chỉ để bù đắp phần nào cái sự hy sinh mất mát của họ với đất nước trong cuộc chiến tranh. Khách quan mà nói thì đồng bào của họ ở hải ngoại thật sự may mắn có được cuộc sống an lành hạnh phúc hiện nay. Một phần nào đó là do sự hy sinh của họ vì tự do của quê hương mẹ Việt Nam. Hội HO cứu trợ thương phế binh và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa mong được quý ân nhân cũ và mới qua các vận động của cá nhân, gia đình và đoàn thể tiếp tục mở rộng vòng tay và tấm lòng giúp đỡ cho thương phế binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa sống những ngày tháng cuối cùng trong an lành. Hội HO cứu trợ thương phế binh và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa rất biết ơn ông bà đã lớn tuổi, một số tuy đã ra đi vẫn nhắc nhở con cháu và các thế hệ tiếp nối lưu tâm giúp đỡ thương phế binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, chẳng hạn như vận động với nơi làm việc, hãng xưởng hay là công ty ủng hộ thêm machine với cái số tiền các em cho là 10 đồng, 20 đồng đó, nhưng giúp góp gió thành bão cho hội có phương tiện để giúp đỡ cho thương phế binh. Và cần giải thích thêm là bây giờ phải biết là qua tiếp xúc với giới trẻ đó thì tôi thấy nhiều em bỡ ngỡ không biết thương phế binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa là những ai và tại sao cần giúp họ, và họ khác với thương phế binh bộ đội xã hội chủ nghĩa thế nào. Thì tôi xin để các em hiểu về chế độ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa qua môi trường sống tự do, qua nghiên cứu, qua tìm hiểu và tùy tấm lòng nhân ái của các em nhín một chút tiêu vặt vào buổi sáng để chia sẻ nỗi đau khổ từ vật chất đến tinh thần của người mang thương tật suốt đời. Các em có thể giúp con cháu của các thương phế binh và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa trong vấn đề học vấn, giúp đỡ từ đứa học giỏi cho đến đứa mà học kém, để các em đó có một cái nghề sinh sống và hiểu biết tối thiểu đòi hỏi công bằng cho cách đối xử với những người ở lại của chế độ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa. Các em có cơ hội kêu gọi chính phủ Mỹ giúp đỡ và kêu gọi Liên Hiệp Quốc xem xét giúp đỡ trực tiếp cho người thương phế binh, thương tật Việt Nam Cộng Hòa. Xin trân trọng cảm ơn ban tổ chức và quý hội thảo viên. Xin chúc tất cả quý vị được một luôn bình an. Xin cảm ơn.
Next, we have Mr. Nguyen Dak Thanh, who is the founding president of the Vietnamese American Foundation in Houston, and he will discuss his organization's effort to account for Arvin missing in war as well as in re-education camp. Mời bác Nguyen Dak Thanh ạ.
Thank you, professional Thai. And furthermore, we would like to thank you, professional Thai and professional Thường Vũ, every people here. Give me a chance to be here to present what we are doing for our project for Vietnamese American doing for our project about the restoration for Bien Hoa Cemetery and rebuttal about the person who died in the re-education camp. But in beginning, so we would like to introduce to you about our delegation. Dr. Dong Châu is president of VF now, and Mr. Kương, he is vice president for VAF, and would like to thank you, every people. Vietnamese American Foundation, formerly known as Tổng hội HO, and was established in July 1995 and on February 29, 2009. The organization changed its name to be Vietnamese American Foundation, and VAF primary objectives are as follows. First of all, request both of Vietnamese and United States government to address our issue of the remains of the Army of the Republic Vietnam soldier missing during the war and died in re-education camp. We would like to rebury to Bien Hoa Cemetery and seeking the permission for restoration Bien Hoa Cemetery. Since January 2007, VF has received the support from the Vietnam Foreign Affairs. And Mr. Trần Quang Quang, Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs, former Prime Minister Võ Văn Kiệt, historian, National Assembly member Dương Trung Quốc, and Deputy Minister Foreign Affairs Nguyễn Phú Bình, Nguyễn Thanh Sơn, và Vũ Hồng Nam. It has three delegations from Ministry of Foreign Affairs led by Deputy Nguyễn Thanh Sơn and Vũ Hồng Nam. 3 times went to Houston to discuss and approve for us for restore the Republic of Vietnam National Cemetery in Bien Hoa. But only on verbal. They never signed any agreement. This is special from Vietnam. Former Prime Minister Võ Văn Kiệt support VF to negotiate with the Bình Dương authority for allow it for restoration Bien Hoa Cemetery. They agree, but unlucky for me, when I come back to see the Bình Dương, Võ Văn Kiệt, he's dead. We have the support from the U.S. Consul General in Vietnam, Mr. Lê Tấn Ân, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Matthew Palmer. The U.S. Department of State and U.S. Department of Defense support us too. Senator Jim Webb, Congressman John Cornyn, and Congressman Edward Roy. In total, we have 22 other Congress members signed joint letter and sent a letter to VAF to support VAF about our issue. During the visit to Vietnam, Congressman Alain Lowenthal visit to Republic of Vietnam National Military Cemetery. Ambassador Ted Ozot and Daniel Christenbrink, along with the VAF chairman and representative from Bình Dương authority, met a series of five consecutive 5 times the visit to cemetery to observe and for the next proposal restoration. The VAF successfully campaigned for DNA company to take the test for all of the remains we sent to them with free. They don't charge any money to us. And also VF representative of Australia and Mr. Trần Như Hùng, Tuấn Lê, Châu Xuân Hùng, and several young friends in Australia raised a fundraising to 3 states and offer for us about 42,000 to verify and all expense for the flight to Vietnam and then to do business for the Làng Đá Cemetery. VAF faced numerous difficulties and danger, especially after Mr. Văn Kiet's death. The Department of Homeland Security investigated my trip when I was in Vietnam to meet the Vietnam Ministry for Foreign Affairs. They asked me, "What are you doing?" And after that, the very Minister Nguyễn Phú Bình informed me that I received 10,000 to collect one remain for the family, although I never go to the jungle to find the remain. But this information they give for Nguyễn Phú Bình that I get the money 10,000. In Hanoi, when I was informed that the police was surrounding the hotel where I was staying in. The police questioned my friend that they want to check his email and what communicated between me and him. And they thinking about we are involved in political activity. The Vietnamese Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared that it supports VAF, but they never give a permit and they never doing any decision regarding about resolution of the remand. There are too many contradictory laws that are easy to change without the only allow us oral permission and never issue the permit. Conclusion: that despite facing many difficulties, the VAF has successfully gained the support from the local authority and veteran association and Vietnamese people from all over. The VAF has located 506 graves and excavated 234 graves and sent back to the family 25 set of the remain to their family, including 9 sets of remain which we don't know who are relatives after testing the DNA. Concerning the Bien Hoa Cemetery, the VAF successfully gained the support from local authority and the Veteran Association. Local authority demolished the old restroom and the demolition to clear the area of the tree and the grass, and then they built a new altar, and the black stone were worn as in the Nghĩa Vụ Dũng Đài. 2013, VAF successfully lobbied authority in the Di An district to cancel the plan. They construct the road through the cemetery. The VAF lobbied local authority to demolish two houses and to cow shit, relocated to family, and they are living in the cemetery. And we complete the restoration 16,000 grave until now. The VAF lobbied to Bình Dương authority to cut down the tree that grow up on the top of the grave and along and the cemetery. This is my idea. The war may have ended, but left behind many things. Instead of releasing prisoners, the winning side imprisoned nearby nearly 1 million soldier, government officials, and officials who served for Republic of Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of people died after the end of the war. The winning side did not allow the burial of the Army of Republic of Vietnam soldiers in the battlefield. Provincial Republic of Vietnam military cemetery were destroyed, leaving only the Bien Hoa National Military. But it was abandoned and renamed the People Cemetery of Bình An. This was an attempt to turn the Republic of Vietnam National Military Cemetery into the civilian cemetery. Those who served of Republic of Vietnam and who still live in Vietnam face civil discrimination and mistreatment. The Republic of Vietnam soldiers released from re-education camp and resettled in the United States, in addition to physical injury, suffer from psychological wounds that cannot be treated. The feeling betrayed by the ally, and they do not have a good chance to defend by themselves. In the United States, they have been pulled into the new struggle for survival on informed. They cannot speak English and unskilled, then they find it extremely difficult. Some of Vietnam soldiers, Republic of Vietnam soldiers, former re-education camp prisoners, the Vietnamese who resettled in the United States before the end of the war have made a significant effort to help in the same let a fortunate individual in the same situation. However, many obstacles were limited the success and the humanitarian effort. With 17 years to struggle for the DC, VAF had many thoughts how we can grow with the Vietnamese community to support our struggle. We need to prove what benefit the United States and Vietnam government and Vietnamese American community would gain from supporting our cause. Most important is they will not be harmed, and if any, it will not be significant. The second is the power of the voting, because if we vote the Congresswomen, they will support back to us. We need to support from the American media because they will support us. They will deliver the evidence, the document, the truth to our cause, to allow them to report and explain to the American public. The appeal to the conscience, the responsibility of the country committee to protecting the 1973 Paris Agreement. They must take responsibility for the DC. The education. We need to support the education program in elementary, middle, and high school. Finally, the organization of the struggle need to empathize, support, and share each other. Thank you.
Next, we have Sabrina Thomas. You want to come here, or?
Good morning, afternoon, maybe afternoon. I'm really honored to be part of this conference and this extremely impressive panel. I fully acknowledge I'm an outsider here to the experience of those that I'm going to speak about today. I'm not Amerasian, nor am I Vietnamese or Vietnamese American. I came to this topic strictly as a scholar, right? So while I can relate to some of the Amerasian perspective in terms of mixed race identity and belonging, I certainly do not pretend to speak for Amerasians who are very capable of speaking for themselves and who right now are trying very hard to get their voices heard. So I just want to make sure that we're good on that. Okay, so in terms of who the war has left behind, when the war ended in April 1975, tens of thousands of Amerasian children, the sons and daughters of American citizen men and Vietnamese women, were left behind in Vietnam. This phrase, left behind, is a bit murky, right, for the Amerasians, specifically because during the war and the 20 years after the war, the United States and Vietnam debated about whether Amerasians actually had been left behind and who had left them. American humanitarians and adoption workers had long argued throughout the war that Amerasians were children of American fathers and therefore were American children who the American government had the responsibility to save, right? First from the violence of the Vietnam War, and then of course from the communists who won the war. Saving Amerasians mainly looked like shipping them to the United States, where they would be or could be adopted by middle-class white American families. During the war, the government of the Republic of Vietnam often disagreed with this assertion, insisting that Amerasians were not American children but were Vietnamese children and should be treated no differently than any of the other children of Vietnam who were suffering from the violence of the war. After the war, immediately after the war, Vietnam's communist government even accused the United States of stealing its Amerasians, who it said the US government was using for Cold War propaganda, while also then taking the opportunity to condemn the uncivilized behavior of American soldiers that created the Amerasians in the first place. So the question of whether Amerasians were actually left behind was not really answered until the 1980s when President Ronald Reagan signed two pieces of legislation. In 1982, the Amerasian Immigration Act, and in 1987, the Amerasian Homecoming Act. And both of those pieces of legislation by about 1994 allowed over about 90,000 Amerasians and their family members to immigrate to the United States as the sons and daughters of American citizens. I'm saying that in quotes because the US government doesn't actually acknowledge that fully, right? Vietnam during the 1980s let the Amerasians leave at that time, viewing them by the 1980s to be more of kind of a PR problem. They were a bit of a nuisance by that time. So most of the Amerasians by the 1980s were between the ages of 8 and 20 years old. Many of them were living in the major cities where American soldiers had once lived or played. By the 1980s, a lot of them were uneducated or undereducated, unemployed or underemployed. Some of them were homeless, right? And so this becomes kind of a problem for the government of Vietnam. Western journalists during the 80s made it a habit of coming to Vietnam and taking photographs of these, quote, American-faced children who were living on the streets and begging for food and writing these stories about them, which then gave credence to the claims of the United States during the Cold War that Vietnam's communist government treated its people and its children badly. So the legislation in '82 and in 1987 allowed Vietnam to kind of deport this problem, right, while satisfying the desire of Americans who during the 1980s sought to save these children. And so this kind of seemed to resolve the issue. Amerasians were children that the United States had left behind, and they should then be in the United States. This photo is also on the cover of my book, and I'm happy to talk about it in discussion if you'd like, but of Le Van Minh is the picture that kind of tuned a lot of Americans into the population of Amerasians in Vietnam after the war. It's obviously a very striking photo. He had polio. His leg deformations is not a result of Agent Orange, although that was the story that was written. And it's his picture that really kind of got Americans up in arms about making sure that we saved these children from the communists in Vietnam, and like, look at what they're doing to our kids. Amerasians in the United States have spent a lot of energy since the war in trying to do things to not only help Amerasians who are still in Vietnam immigrate to the United States, but also to resettle in ways that are positive. There are, of course, a number of other organizations and individual activists who were part of these efforts and continue to be part of these efforts. But in terms of Amerasians specifically, in the past few decades, there are a few that I would kind of point to. Really recently, there's a gentleman by the name of Kirk Kellerhals, who is a documentarian whose documentaries on, he goes to throughout the United States and to Vietnam and interviews Amerasians about their experience. He himself is an Amerasian who found his father and his mother, I think in 2019. And so he's now making movies about these experiences, and his last movie, Intersections, just won a lot of awards. So I would point you to that. But the activist that I would give a lot of credit in this area to is Jimmy Miller, whose name is really familiar within the Amerasian community. Miller and his organization, Amerasians Without Borders, is responsible for helping Amerasians still living in Vietnam connect with their American fathers, find them if they can, connect with them, and then immigrate to the United States through the Homecoming Act. So he's doing a lot of the work on the ground in making sure that there's a pathway for Amerasians who want to come to the United States to do so. He gets a lot of credit from me because the Amerasian Homecoming Act, which is still in effect but doesn't have any money tied to it, really it was defunded in 1994, has become increasingly difficult to navigate, and he's done a phenomenal job of navigating a lot of those issues. Currently, Amerasians left behind, there are about 200 Amerasians left behind in Vietnam who want to come to the United States, and currently they will all be in their 50s and 60s. Many of them have lives and families of their own who would, if they came to the United States, they wouldn't want to leave behind. And so this makes them a not very interesting group of people for the US government to want to immigrate to the United States. They're not very interested in bringing adults and families, right, from a war that we also don't really talk about in ways in the United States as excited as they were to bring them as children when they were cute and cuddly. So that's become kind of an interest. At this age, also for a lot of those Amerasians, if their fathers survived the war in Vietnam, they are probably not alive, and if they are alive, it's difficult to track them down. So that makes the expectation that the Homecoming Act continues to have, that fathers have to validate their claims, have to say kind of that's my kid, or provide evidence that that's my kid, that makes it harder if they're not alive. The emergence of DNA testing has proven super helpful to these efforts in the past decade or so. And DNA kits are what Jimmy Miller and his organization use often to confirm American paternity. They are now kind of an unofficial requirement of the Homecoming Act as well. So even though it's not written into the Homecoming Act that you have a DNA test, this is the first thing that Miller and his folks do on the ground to ensure that they have evidence of American paternity. The challenges of navigating the Homecoming Act, currently under an increasingly anti-immigrant federal government, or anti-immigration federal government, continue to be burdensome because there's also no clear standard for Amerasians who are applying to come to the United States through the act. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, the test was, what do you look like, right? So you would have American interviewers stand in the American Transit Center or Bangkok and look at applicants and say, well, you look American enough, and so you can come, right? That doesn't happen anymore. So they rely solely on documented evidence. So that would be a DNA test or birth certificate or photographs or letters, things like that. But that's also applied inconsistently in terms of establishing paternity. There are numerous cases of Amerasians who have all the documents, plus the DNA test, right, that verifies that they're American, that they have American paternity, who have been rejected. There are also cases of Amerasians who have all the documents, plus the DNA test, plus a living father who says, that's my kid, who have been rejected, or who have all the documents, DNA tests, and the family of a father who's passed away who says, that's our father's child, who have been rejected. So this creates a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration for Amerasians in Vietnam who are kind of stuck and trying to figure out what they need in order to come to the United States, and also kind of undermines this idea that we agreed to in the 80s that these are our children and that we have left them behind. The other part that's come up more recently is that in addition to the DNA test, the US government now requires a DD-214, which is the father's military record of service, okay? So this is problematic for Amerasians whose fathers were associated with the war. They were in Vietnam during the war. It's how they got here. But they didn't serve, they weren't active military. They were contractors, so they were civilian contractors. So for those Amerasians, they have no chance anymore of coming to the United States under the Homecoming Act because we don't recognize them, which is somewhat ironic. But unless they have a DD-214, their application won't even be reviewed in terms of immigration. So that's also a problem. So I guess what I've heard from those on the ground is that the government in Vietnam is very supportive of the efforts of Amerasians in Vietnam to immigrate to the United States, to no longer feel as though they are left behind. And so they're building lots of bridges for that to happen. The US government has decided to build walls, right, instead, and to put a lot of obstacles in the way of those Amerasians, and so the two governments are not aligned in terms of what the response and resolution for Amerasians is. A lot of Amerasian activists and organizations right now are hoping that the 2025 commemoration of the end of the war is an opportunity to pressure US Congress folks to do something, right, to change that practice. And again, 200 people, this is kind of the notion around for Amerasian activists who I've talked to is like, it's only 200 people, right? We've got to be able to do something to allow them to come to the United States. Whether or not that will happen, I think this is the opportunity for that to happen. The other thing that those activists are pushing for is citizenship, birthright citizenship for those Amerasians who did come, because even though we called them and allowed them to immigrate to the United States as children of American fathers, sons and daughters of American fathers, the United States never granted US citizenship to those folks, right? So unless they knew that when they came over, which many didn't, because, oh, I'm an American child, right, I come, you assume you have citizenship. Unless they knew that coming in, they never had citizenship, which means that when you have administrations like the Trump administration in 2016 and 2017 that kind of reinterpreted agreements with Vietnam, that they then had kind of the opportunity to deport Amerasians who might have had criminal records. That's a whole different conversation, but criminal records, because part of that administration's goal was to get rid of bad immigrants, right? And so a number of Amerasians, along with a number of Vietnamese refugees who came under some of those programs, were deported as a result of that reinterpretation, okay? One of the questions we were asked to address is, what do those who were left behind and who are still in Vietnam think of the Vietnamese diaspora? I don't think that I'm qualified to answer that question. I did speak to a number of my colleagues who are Amerasian, as well as Jimmy Miller, since he's on the ground, and asked them this question, so I will kind of summarize what they said. And generally, they all agreed that Amerasians in Vietnam feel very supported by Vietnamese Americans today, that they very much feel themselves as part of the diaspora, that they have a shared history with Vietnamese Americans, with Vietnamese immigrants and refugees. That history of war, right, of immigration, of resettlement, of disadvantage, of discrimination, of family separation, right, and of identity. And so their interest right now overall is to getting enough support to help vocalize their desire to have citizenship and immigration rights. People have talked a lot this morning about how do you engage younger generations or other generations in some of these issues. And I would say, I'm a history professor, this is the dilemma of all history teachers, right? How do you make current young folks care about the past? And as a historian, I would say that we have to know about our past in order to understand our present, that's critical, but young people don't know that. So in my experience, making this history personal for people in those generations is the way that you do it. And so I can tell you that students who take my Vietnam War class tend to be students who had a grandfather, now a grandfather, used to be a father, now a grandfather, or an uncle or somebody who served in the war, usually from the United States side. And they were people who served but also talked about it, right? And so they're, oh, my grandpa used to talk about the time that he did this. Or saw their relative have a really negative effect from the war. Oh, my grandfather was an alcoholic and my mom said it was from the war, so I'm taking this class to understand, right? So that's personal for those students. As I've gotten older, the number of students who have personal connections to the war has decreased. And so the danger, of course, in that is that when folks start to pass away, that then you have opportunity, if people haven't taken that history personal, you have opportunity for that history to go away also, or to be reinterpreted in ways by people who were never there. So my insight would just be that one of the ways that you make connections for younger generations to history for older generations or vice versa is that you tell your stories. No matter how painful they are, right? You share your experiences, your trauma, your pain with those younger folks who you may not believe listen now, but they're in my class, right? They're talking about, I don't know what it looks like when they're having that interaction. They may not listen to anything Grandpa says, right? But they heard it and they're curious about it. And that will be the same for the younger generation. Kids are the same, regardless of where you come from. They're the same in terms of how they're operating, right? And history tends to become relevant for people as they get older because you get closer to death and you're like, oh, I should really know about my life, right? But in these cases, I think it's really important that you continue to share your stories, because if you don't, then the danger is that somebody else will take those stories from you and they will not make them personal. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, especially for really focusing on answering all the questions that we posted, right? Next, we have Andrew Wells Dang, who will speak about the Vietnam War Legacy and Reconciliation Initiative at USIP. Give me 1 second here. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of the three presenters before me, Bak Thuy, Bak Thang, and Sabrina, for really moving and informative remarks. I'd like to use this time to share a little more about the U.S. Institute of Peace Vietnam program, how it relates to this theme of caring for those harmed and affected by the war, and ways that some of us can work together on shared goals. And there are many of those, but I'll talk about three, which are huge and challenging in themselves. One is on recovering and honoring those who have died from all sides of the war, and those who are still listed as missing. And I'll talk especially about DNA analysis as part of that. Second is the effects of Agent Orange, which is one of the things that makes the Vietnam War and aftermath different from all other wars that the US and other countries have fought. And third is this question that's come up already today about memory and memorialization, and how Americans and Vietnamese can remember the war, past trauma, and healing and reconciliation in a way that's respectful to all sides. So, shared a little bit about the U.S. Institute of Peace already this morning. We were founded by Congress in 1984, so we have this very idealistic vision and mission. And we work with bipartisan support. We're not a U.S. government agency in the sense of being under the executive branch or embassy or State Department, right? But we have U.S. government funding. And Congress does play a role in sometimes suggesting work that we do. So the Vietnam War Legacies and Reconciliation Initiative, which started in 2021, came about on the request of Congress, especially former Senator Patrick Leahy, who's an important figure here because he also started the Leahy War Victims Fund and Displaced Children and Orphans Funds in 1989 first. And the first project that they funded was to Vietnam Assistance for the Handicapped, which is a Vietnamese American-led NGO that was, and still is, providing prosthetics and orthotics to amputees, including ARVN veterans. Anyway, so what we're doing in the last 2 years, so we work on public education in the US and in Vietnam, and communications about these physical war legacies and on US-Vietnam relations generally. We hold events such as one featuring Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon, who's on the left there, who came last month. We get together US veterans. In the picture at the middle, I'm returning a piece of an airplane to a US former prisoner of war that I was asked to bring back from Vietnam. We also work with youth in the US and in Vietnam, with Vietnamese Americans and other civil society groups. So we organize events and dialogues. So one of the projects we're involved in is called the Vietnam Wartime Accounting Initiative. And I've got some bilingual text here because I had this from another presentation. So this is a program that started also 2 years ago, led by the US Department of Defense. And its purpose is to help Vietnam identify missing from the war. And I'll say some more about the challenges and tensions involved in that in a minute, okay? So it has these 6 components that are implemented by various US and international partners. So USIP is involved in 2 of them. There's a research component led by Harvard University. And then the 6th part is building DNA analysis capacity in Vietnam that's being implemented by a group called the International Commission on Missing Persons, which is an international organization based in the Netherlands. In order to do that, so at the moment they are working to improve technology in labs in Vietnam to be able to do better and more effective DNA analysis of remains, and they're testing that. In order for it to succeed, it will need also reference samples from the population, because you have a set of unidentified remains, you can extract DNA from it, hopefully. In order to identify who that person was, you have to compare it to a relative, and you have to know who those relatives might be. And so this applies for anyone, right? And also for Vietnamese in the US who have relatives who might still be missing in Vietnam. So finally, some activities that we've implemented are video stories of families of the missing, some publications, interviews, social media, presentations. We've had an annual dialogue and other events in Washington, and a series of both online and in-person dialogues among Americans and Vietnamese, including Vietnamese Americans. And again, we see all sides of the conflict as worthy of telling stories, listening, and remembering. We want to include everyone. I had another slide that I sent in late, which isn't here, but I'll describe it. And it was an attempt to compare what is being done and what's available for US veterans and families, for People's Army and Viet Cong veterans and families in Vietnam, and for ARVN veterans and families. You know, one of the things is that we have quite exact numbers for the first two. We know that there were 1,973 missing Americans at the end of the war, and 729 of those have been identified and remains have been returned to their families. That leaves 1,200 or so still unaccounted for, right? For the North Vietnamese revolutionary side, we have numbers that are given, but we don't know how exact or correct they are, but they're very large. They're in the 180,000 missing, 300,000 remains in cemeteries in Vietnam who are not identified. For ARVN, I don't have any data. I've seen a number of ARVN combat losses during the war, a very exact number, but I don't know how many missing from the war. And then there's also the question of after the war, as Bac Thang was mentioning, right? And then, of course, there are also civilian deaths and missing in Vietnam as well. You know, on the US side, there is what's called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. That's who searches for missing Americans from all recent 20th century wars. But it really started with the Vietnam War, and that's still a main part of their mission. It's limited by law to only searching for Americans, right? In Vietnam, there is a national steering committee led by the Ministry of Defense, who also has the mandate to look for missing from their side of the conflict. And again, that's a large number that they really don't have the resources to do, and it's still going on all these years after. In terms of memorialization, there's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC, right near my office, pictured on right, which, as everyone knows, has the names of all of the 58,000 plus Americans who died in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there are war memorials in every commune, 11,000 communes that have some names and some graves which may or may not have remains in them, right? For Republic of Vietnam soldiers and missing, there are no such memorials, right? There is the Bien Hoa Cemetery as a site. There are a few memorials privately in the US and in some localities. So what do we need, right? As part of this wartime accounting initiative, my view, and I think the view of all the US participants, is that this should apply to everyone. What is the process for searching for, identifying, recovering, honoring remains from the Republic of Vietnam? How can this be done? There's no agency or state that's responsible, but I think there are people involved who would like to make this more possible. We need more stories of families of the missing, right? Which, again, a couple pictures here of an interview with a Vietnamese family in northern Vietnam on the left, and of the family of a US missing pilot who was recovered several years ago in the middle. So more stories and videos would help to make this case. I haven't mentioned Agent Orange, maybe for purposes of time, I won't go into that much, but we also need a lot more information about that. We know that ARVN soldiers handled Agent Orange, loaded it onto airplanes in Bien Hoa and Da Nang, but those stories have not been told much, and we don't know very much about people who were affected as a result, whether they're now in the US or still in Vietnam. So there are obstacles for this. One of the obstacles is the Vietnamese government doesn't see it as a priority. It's hard to have public discussion about these topics in Vietnam, but I think it's possible to find some allies and ways to do it. And this is one reason it took so long for the Wartime Accounting Initiative that we're part of to get started. So some people, including in the US government, were reluctant to work with the Vietnamese government on these issues until there was a way to include ARVN missing. And that could not be negotiated at the time with Vietnam. I understand that position, right? This should be for everyone. On the other hand, we need to start somewhere. And so doing what's possible now could be a way to have more space to do more things later, but that really depends on us. On the DNA question, right? This DNA capacity in Vietnam, if it increases, could potentially enable identification of all remains from any side. We shouldn't expect, at least at the moment, the Vietnamese government would include remains from the other side, from their view, in their government program. But the private sector could contribute. The US could contribute. And again, it's a question of, is that politically possible to work on that? I think it is. So to conclude the 2025 anniversary, which is the sub-theme of this conference, is an opportunity to work on all of these questions and also on memorialization that I mentioned at the beginning. Because there's media interest, there is now this new US-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. It sounds nice. What it really means, we need to work to put it into practice. So what can be done as symbols or manifestations of reconciliation and this partnership in the next few years? One thing that we're working on at USIP is an exhibit at the War Remnants Museum in Saigon about US-Vietnam cooperation. It's mainly about Agent Orange and UXO. That will tell part of the story, but not all of it. we are interested to think about other things that could be done in Vietnam and here that bring people together. One idea is in certain sites of memorialization, and one of them is Bien Hoa Cemetery. Another one perhaps is the Quang Chi Citadel, so site of one of the most destructive battles in 1972, and perhaps others too. So, doing any of this requires resources, plans, cooperation to do it, and more discussion. It won't be easy, or else it would have already happened. It does require working with Vietnamese government counterparts. That's a big challenge, especially now. Some ways to make that possible are to focus on arts and culture and on people's stories, making it academic, involving universities and research institutes makes it more possible, and involving young people, I think, also opens this up to something that's perhaps more likely to get done and not be blocked. And it requires working together among people with different views. We may not all agree all the time on how we interpret the past or on some of the details of it, but if we have a common goal, it is possible to do it. And this is what we see as a US way of peace building. That's not just government. It involves the private sector. It involves civil society. And we can show to people in Vietnam and elsewhere that this is something we can learn from and do together. So thank you all for listening. Look forward to questions and discussion with my panelists and everyone else here. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's 1:12. We have 20 minutes for Q&A, right? We'll try to kind of address these questions, but I think, based on the conversation we have had this morning, it seems very lively that you raise very, very quality questions to the panelists. So shall we open up the floor for any questions you might have for any of the panelists or any comment?
Thank you. One of the things that I heard from, sorry, this seems too loud, from Professor Thomas is that we need to have some sort of like a passing experience from the previous generation to the next in order to preserve the heritage or whatnot. I come from a generation where a lot of my contemporaries went through the kind of trauma that have been discussed here today, but they were arriving in the U.S. young enough to now become successful and have successful kids. And what I learned is that their successful kids have no idea what their parents went through. And we're talking about these are young people who are, otherwise open-minded, comfortable with discussing things with their kids. So what can we do to encourage parents, even the ones that are older than me, they're even more hesitant to discuss their experience, their traumatic experience with their children. And it's not just for Professor Thomas, but for all panelists. I just got the idea from her presentation. What is it that we can do, not about the kids, but about the parents, how to encourage the parents to start talking?
Yeah, could you please?
Yeah, that's a question within communities and culture that I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer. What I know as in the oral histories that I do, especially with older folks from generations who are taught, who have learned not to talk about hardship. My own family comes from a generation like that also, is that if at some point in everybody's life, they start to think about what legacy they want to leave. And if you can get somebody at that moment to start to answer questions, not to expect that willingly, these folks are going to just start saying, oh my gosh, remember when this happened? That's not going to happen. But if young people can start to ask questions of their parents or their grandparents, I'm always surprised at what people are willing to answer when that comes about. If it's a genuine question. So, a lot of teachers at some point in high school or whatever will say, hey, go interview your dad or go interview your mom or somebody in the community. And those assignments I always thought were kind of corny, but as I get older and work with students and also people in oral histories, I realize that people really want to tell their story because it's all we have. Like, all of us want to have some sort of memory that's left of us. We want to be remembered well. Every single person in the world wants to be remembered well. But we don't know how to create that memory often, especially if we've suppressed it so long. So I'm not a psychologist, but my only suggestion is if we can somehow inspire young people to begin asking questions instead of making that the responsibility of the people who went through the trauma, that would maybe be a first step. I don't know, do you want to answer?
Hello, everyone. This is a question directed for all of you. It's a really long question, and I'm going to say it in Vietnamese first and then English. So, tôi muốn hỏi về cái quá trình của cuộc thảo luận ở bên chính phủ Hoa Kỳ về mặt cứu trợ thương phế bình và quả phụ Việt Nam Cộng Hòa và cái chương trình phục hồi nghĩa trang Biên Hòa. Tại vì ông Nguyễn Đắc Thành nói là VAF đã nhận được sự ủng hộ từ bên chính phủ Hoa Kỳ, và Professor Welsding cũng nói về những chương trình của chính phủ Hoa Kỳ để tìm những cựu binh Hoa Kỳ, không phải là cựu binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, Agent Orange vân vân. Và trong khi đó thì bà Nguyễn Thanh Thủy cũng nói là chính phủ Hoa Kỳ không quan tâm đến vấn đề vấn đề các thương phế bình Việt Nam Cộng Hòa bị kẹt lại ở Việt Nam, và chính phủ Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ cũng không giúp việc tìm được các cựu binh Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, tù nhân Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, và có lẽ hiện nay chính phủ Hoa Kỳ cũng không quan tâm đến những người Malaysia nữa. Ngoài ra thì Sabrina Thomas cũng nói về cái sự chuyển đổi của chính quyền Trump và nay là chính quyền Biden để trục xuất hàng ngàn người bị tị nạn không có quốc tịch Mỹ, và ngay cả trong cộng đồng người Việt thì ít người đang quan tâm đến cái vấn đề đó. Thì tôi muốn hỏi về cái quá trình vận động cho những vấn đề này, và cái gì mình thành công ở chỗ nào, tại sao mình thành công hay không thành công, và những gì và cộng đồng người Việt hải ngoại có thể làm một cách thành công để có tiếng nói trong cả hai chính phủ Hoa Kỳ và chính phủ Việt Nam để giải quyết những vấn đề này. So the question is essentially that I want to talk about the process and the discussions, especially in terms of governments of both Vietnam and America, talking about helping disabled veterans and restoring the Biên Hòa Cemetery. And I know that some of you have talked about that there has been support, such as Agent Orange, finding memorializing American veterans, restoring the Biên Hòa Cemetery. But at the same time, giống như bà Nguyễn Thanh Thủy, she said that the American government doesn't really see that as an issue, especially for disabled veterans, and that the American government is not involved in the process of, let's say, finding the remains of missing veterans in Vietnam, as well as boat people who are stranded in America. And so I wanted to ask, especially, and also Sabrina Thomas talked a little bit about the shift in legislation in which the Trump and Biden administrations are beginning to deport thousands of Vietnamese refugees back to Vietnam in renegotiating the agreement. So I was wondering, essentially for all of you, what has been successful, what has not been successful, especially in terms of advocating on the American and Vietnamese government sides, and what are some things that we can do? Sorry, I know it's long.
It's okay. Sabrina, you want? Mời bác Thành. Go.
Thưa tất cả quý vị ở đây, thì tôi xin thưa cái phần mà về thương phế binh. Về thương phế binh đó, thì tôi biết từ trước nay là cái sự giúp đỡ của hội chúng tôi là đều do cái tiền gây quỹ và của các ân nhân đồng hương hải ngoại, nghĩa là tất cả từ tuổi người lớn cho tới các em trẻ. Trước vấn đề mà về thương phế binh thì cái này tôi chỉ nói là tôi chỉ nghe chứ hội chưa bao giờ được. Và nghe là theo như Liên Hiệp Quốc có cho tiền cho thương phế binh Việt Nam thì phải cho cái tiền đó cho cái thương phế binh của Việt Nam Cộng Hòa nữa, chứ không phải riêng của bộ đội đó không. Nhưng mà từ hồi đó tới giờ, tất cả những thương phế binh mà chúng tôi có danh sách đó chưa bao giờ có nhận được tiền của bên phía Việt Nam xã hội chủ nghĩa đó. Thành ra do đó chúng tôi muốn ở đây thì nhờ các em trẻ bây giờ có trình độ và theo dõi dùm. Vì tôi biết á, là hồi năm ngoái Liên Hiệp Quốc có cho một số tiền để cho những người mà không được dùng là thương phế binh của chiến tranh, mà chỉ dùng là người bị thương tật thôi, là thương tật của chế độ vậy thôi, chứ không có dùng cái tiếng là thương phế binh. Cho nên năm ngoái chúng tôi có nghe và chúng tôi có tìm hiểu để gửi, nhưng mà quá cái thời hạn của Liên Hợp Quốc đó thì năm nay nghe nói cũng phát lại. Nhưng mà đặc biệt là không được dùng cái chữ là thương phế binh của chiến tranh Việt Nam đó, mà chỉ dùng cái tiếng là thương tật. Thì đó là những điều mà hội và những người đa số là tuổi lớn, thì ở đây mong quý vị là tuổi trẻ hơn và trình độ cao hơn thì giúp dùm hội theo dõi những cái tin tức gì biết đó, để chúng tôi có hồ sơ sẵn thì chúng tôi đưa lên đó. Thì chúng tôi có thể nói là chúng tôi có làm hồ sơ để cho sắp tới đây tôi nghe nói là phái đoàn của Liên Hiệp Quốc sẽ có qua bên Việt Nam. Nhưng mà cái vấn đề mà muốn tiếp xúc thẳng với thương phế binh tôi rất là khó, là tại vì vấn đề đó nó liên quan tới sự sống của thương phế binh đó, là để tiếp xúc rồi thương phế binh có ảnh hưởng gì không sau khi phái đoàn ra về đó. Thành ra đó là xin các quý vị giúp đỡ giùm đó, là về cái phần mà của chính phủ Mỹ cũng như là chính phủ của bên Liên Hiệp Quốc. Đó là các quý vị trẻ hơn thì theo dõi đó giúp chúng tôi. Nó phần nữa thì gây quỹ chúng tôi muốn là bây giờ các em ở đây trẻ đó thì các em còn đi làm, còn những ân nhân bây giờ lớn tuổi quá rồi, thành ra họ chỉ giúp bằng cái tiền già thôi. Thì mỗi tháng các bác đó tội nghiệp lắm, các bác về gửi 20 đồng, tháng nào cũng gửi 20 đồng. Các bác nói bác chỉ có 20 đồng mỗi tháng là đầu tháng là gửi liền, chứ nếu mà nhiều nữa đóng một lần thì bác không có thể đóng được, cho nên cứ giúp vậy đó. Thành ra ở đó chúng tôi muốn các em ở đây có đi làm đó được thì các em vận động để cho những cái công ty hay là những hãng xưởng gì đó giúp đỡ thêm, machine thêm đó, giống như là những gia đình có em đó, các em đi làm đó thì bây giờ có giúp như thế đó. Đó là hai phần mà chúng tôi muốn là nhờ các thế hệ trẻ đó, giúp dùng cái phần đó. Tại vì thiệt thòi của thương phế binh nhiều lắm. Nếu mà nhận được những cái lời mà họ gọi qua với những cái thơ họ viết đó, là tôi thấy không ai dằn được nước mắt đó, rất là khốn khổ. Bây giờ tôi điển hình đó, tôi nói thẳng, tôi nêu tên luôn là ông đại tá Trần Nhật đó, không quân đó, ổng về tận Quế luôn, ổng về thăm nhà thì ổng có tới xin 10 thương phế binh, thì trong đó 8 thương phế binh có nhận tiền được, là 8 thương phế binh đó ở Quế, nhưng mà ở vùng gần cái thành phố Quế. Còn 2 thương phế binh ở xa hơn, ở vùng xa xôi, mà ông không có đi một mình, ông đi với thân nhân ở Quế. Nhưng mà tới thương phế binh họ nói thẳng, họ không dám nhận tiền, vì nhận tiền xong khách đi ra rồi thì gia đình họ bị làm khó dễ, thành ra họ từ chối, họ nói luôn đó. Thành ra đó là cũng cái gì tôi biết thì tôi trình bày thật sự, chứ năm nào mà những gia đình mà có về Việt Nam đều có xin một số người, thí dụ xin 5-3 người ở quê người ta về, nhưng mà có cái gần thành phố thì trao dễ, nhưng mà xa xôi thì khó. Nhưng mà đặc biệt là cái miền Nam á, thì không bị trường hợp đó,
Cô.
phía miền Tây, nhưng mà miền Trung thì bị đàn áp đó.
Cảm ơn cô. Để nhờ Thủy dịch tạm qua chút.
Yeah, xin phép. So I'd like to clarify that all the funds that so far we've received in our association was from the community. We haven't received anything from the government. And from what I've heard, that the UN has some supportive fund, but they request to use the term disability, not the war veterans. So that's the requirement for them. Last year, we heard about that news, and we wanted to send out the application, but it was past the deadline. So I would like to ask the friends here who may aware of those kind of news, please share with us so we can send out the application. And also, as you all know, that in Vietnam, they have a support for the soldier of the socialists of Vietnam, but never for the war veteran of the Republic of Vietnam. And also, one story that when family or some donor wants to visit some families and give out some support, financial support, is very difficult, especially in the central area. Some wouldn't want to receive it because as soon as the sponsor, the donors left, their families may be questioned by the local authority. So they didn't want to receive that. So again, those who've been supporting us for a long time, they are already senior, old, and they don't have so much resource to give. Though we would like you as a younger who are working, if you know of some kind of other resource, you can ask for a company or association who might want to help us financially in this. Please let me know. Thank you.
Vâng, bác Thành có câu trả lời gì không ạ?
Kính thưa quý vị, cho phép tôi nói bằng tiếng Việt cho nó trôi chảy, cho nó nhanh cho quý vị hiểu. Thì cô thông dịch dùm. Cái thứ nhất thì xin nói rằng là cái cộng đồng Việt Nam ở hải ngoại này cũng như trong nước đều có hai phe. Một phe thì ủng hộ cái nhân đạo, một phe thì vẫn giữ hận thù. Thì ở trong nước đó, nếu mà cái phe nào mà thắng thế đó thì họ cho mình trùng tu nghĩa trang và họ support cho lấy cái hài cốt tù cải tạo. Nhưng mà phe nào mà thắng á, thì mình được lợi hưởng. Thế thì đó là cái thứ nhất. Cái thứ hai nữa đó là trả lời câu hỏi của anh bạn đó. Mình giải quyết vận động như thế nào? Thứ nhất tôi xin nói rằng là truyền thông, media. Năm 75 chúng ta thất bại là vì truyền thông. Cái thứ hai là vận động, dân biểu, là bầu phiếu. Chúng ta có 1 triệu người ở đây, nhưng mà đi bầu phiếu chúng ta đâu có bầu bao nhiêu đâu. Thành ra tiếng nói chúng ta không có. Đó là hai cái. Vấn đề thứ nhất là truyền thông, thứ hai là dân biểu. Cái thứ ba, chúng ta phải chứng tỏ cho Việt Nam, Mỹ và cộng đồng hải ngoại này, nếu mà ủng hộ cái chương trình của chúng ta đó, họ được cái gì, họ có bị lợi cái gì, họ có lợi cái gì và họ có hại cái gì. Cái thứ nhất, cái lợi là họ sẽ có một cái sự hòa giải nếu họ muốn hòa giải thật sự. Nhưng mà thưa quý vị, ở trong nước cũng như ngoài nước, có người muốn hòa giải, có người không muốn hòa giải, thì đó là cái trở ngại của chúng ta. Thì làm thế nào để cho cái truyền thông họ nói lên cái lòng nhân đạo và họ nói lên cái lý lẽ, chúng ta thuyết phục làm sao cái media đó họ support mình thì chúng ta thành công được một phần. Dân biểu bầu, quốc hội bầu thì hành pháp phải làm. Thì hai cái điều này chúng ta tiên quyết phải có vận động. Và cái thứ ba nữa là chúng ta phải làm thế nào để cho đồng bào hải ngoại này nhìn lại thấy hận thù mấy chục năm nay đem lại được cái gì? Không có được cái gì cả. Họ chửi chúng tôi là theo hòa giải, nhưng mà thật sự là cộng đồng ngoài này đã hòa giải với Việt Nam rồi. Quý vị thấy là bỏ cái quy chế tị nạn trở về Việt Nam là quý vị đã hòa giải với người ta rồi. Cứ chửi hòa giải hoài, đó là cái thứ nhất là sai. Cái thứ hai nói rằng là chúng tôi đưa tiền về để nuôi cộng sản. Vậy thì thưa quý vị, mỗi một năm đó cái cộng đồng hải ngoại này gửi về Việt Nam bao nhiêu tỷ đô la? Còn chúng tôi chỉ có đem về có 600-700 ngàn để trùng tu mộ của đồng đội của mình, mà chúng tôi vẫn bị lần đã nuôi cộng sản. Thì cái đó chúng ta phải giải quyết như thế nào? Mình phải giải quyết cho gia đình mình trước, thưa quý vị. Cái thứ hai nữa, thân nhân của mình ở trong nước là cộng sản, làm sao không cộng sản được? Con cháu quý vị, con cháu tôi phải đi làm việc với họ là cộng sản chứ cái gì nữa. Mà mình nuôi nó rồi, mình nuôi cộng sản rồi, và đồng thời con cháu mình để hành hạ đồng bào của mình chứ ai nữa đâu. Thành ra mình phải dạy con cháu mình.
Dạ, cảm ơn bác
Ở
Thành.
đây cũng vậy. Thưa cảm ơn quý vị.
Để cho Thủy có thể dịch lại. Vâng.
Yeah, so there are always two factions, those who support humanitarian activities and those who don't. So we will benefit if in Vietnam there's such a faction who support the humanitarian activities, or we will get some support or be ally with them. To the question about the process of lobbying for such policy, I see two channels. One is using the media, and the second is to use your vote. Vote your representative here, and they will speak to your voice. And to the point that every year we send back home around $600 to $700, and we're still being labeled as a feeding the communists. Remember that the whole community here, Vietnamese Americans, send billions and billions of dollars home, and why do they call us feeding communists? They are our relatives, they are our families, and those people who still unnamed in Bien Hoa Cemetery, they were our comrades, quote unquote. And then for talking about the reconciliation, we are labeled as reconciliation supporter, but in fact we are already reconciled with our community by the fact that we accept as a fact that we already accept some act and policies here. So we here as coming back to support our families, then that's a good process of reconciliation.
Andrew, and could you make it in one sentence?
I second what they said, but just to add a few things about the U.S. government, right? So in Vietnam, it's USAID, so the development agency, that is carrying out most of these programs. And in principle, they are, the ones that the U.S. supports are neutral, available to everyone. So like the Agent Orange disability programs support anyone who has any of the disability effects that are linked to Agent Orange. It's now 10 provinces in the center and south, so places that were sprayed a lot. Now, you'd have to go to each of those provinces to see who actually is benefiting, how well is that applied. It's probably different in different places, I don't know for sure, right? Also, support for unexploded bomb and landmine injuries supports all people who are amputees in places like Quang Tri, right, which would include people who were on both sides of the conflict before 1975. But it's not covering everything, so there's more space to expand that and to ask questions about, is this really benefiting everyone that we want to reach? In the U.S., of course, there's the Veterans Affairs Department, right, which is supporting U.S. veterans. So again, there's this question of needs of the community here. How are they included in what the U.S. government is doing? Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah.
I understand we have a lot of questions, but unfortunately, the food is getting whole cold, right? So just to transfer it over to my esteemed colleague, Kelly Nguyen. She's an assistant professor at UCLA. She's going to try to summarize it in 3 sentences, right?
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. So we've been talking about the diversity of our diasporic experiences, and in the last panel, we were talking about those experiences in terms of, as Jacqueline put it best, metabolizing grief. And today, in this panel, we're talking about the diversity of our concerns across generations as well as across nations. So we talked about our concerns of those who are left behind, the disabled ARVN veterans and widows, the MIA and those who died in re-education camps, Amerasians who were left behind. And Dr. Thomas talked about what does it mean to be left behind, the agency and the power behind that, of who gets to decide who is left behind, what goes behind that, and who is leaving whom. And so behind all of this, what I really heard was that we're talking about considerations of a common humanity, questions of what do we owe to each other. And what was highlighted here are the problems behind the need for governmental recognition of that humanity. For example, the need for government support for sometimes very basic human needs, the right to have food and shelter, for example, the right to medical care. And organizations like those of Ba Thanh Thuy and Bac Thanh have worked really hard around that out of a shared sense of humanity. And we've also discussed the power of the public imagination. So for example, how the media can help amplify these issues, but at what cost? Right, so Dr. Thomas was also talking about the problems of portrayals of the Amerasians, but the consequences of those portrayals in terms of government, US governmental legislation. And so what I've also heard was, well, how do we counter discriminations faced by ARVN veterans, for example, who are still in Vietnam, discriminations of the Amerasians who are left in Vietnam. How do we counter that discrimination with care? Right? How do we channel that care then into action? And the challenges behind that of sustaining and growing that action, but also the challenges of collaboration, right? So what I've heard as well is, how do we move forward from that, right? We have these challenges. And some suggestions here from my esteemed panelists is that the sharing of stories, not just intergenerationally, but also transnationally, as well as the need to inspire the community, the private sector here and in Vietnam, and to learn about these diverse stories, these diverse experiences, our diverse concerns, our diverse cares. To engage with these grassroots movements from the ground up, and that the power does not need to only reside in the government and those who have claimed those power or those who have taken away that power, but that the power can come from us, the community, across borders. Thank you.
Thì Thái xin tóm tắt lại bằng tiếng Việt trong vòng 1-2 câu.
Cho tôi xin nói một câu thôi.
Xin có đồng ý không? Ok, mời bác.
Tôi biết là kết thúc cái chương trình, nhưng mà tôi ở trong hội thương phế binh đã lâu. Tôi muốn nói một câu cuối cùng là ở đây tôi có kêu gọi tất cả quý vị đó có thể vận động đó cho thương phế binh số tiền, nhưng gửi thẳng về thương phế binh thôi, chứ nếu gửi về Việt Nam thì không, Việt Nam xã hội chủ nghĩa đó thì không bao giờ thương phế binh nhận được đâu. Đó là lời cuối cùng tôi nói vậy. Đó, để...
So she basically was saying that, you know, if you raise funds to support these veterans, wounded veterans, right, send it directly to them instead of through a government channel. It's not going to get to the people that you want to send it to them. So the overall emphasis of this panel is that we are addressing a wartime and post-war legacies of issues pertaining to those who were missing in wars and re-education camps, as well as the Amerasian, right? As well as the wounded, right? And how do we address these issues especially when these are issues that are considered sensitive, right? I was supposed to speak in Vietnamese, right? Two sentences. Đây là những cái vấn đề mà chúng ta rất là khó để mà chúng ta có thể giải quyết, tại vì nó là những cái vấn đề mà tất cả liên hệ tới những cái chính phủ, đặc biệt là hai chính phủ Việt Nam và Hoa Kỳ, được xem như là những cái vấn đề gọi là tế nhị và nhạy cảm. Thì thành ra với những cái sự khó khăn này, có bên thì lại ủng hộ, có bên vì lại không ủng hộ, tùy theo tình thế của chính trị, vân vân. thì nó có những cái giải pháp gì mà chúng ta có thể đặt ra để tiếp cận những cái, để giải quyết những cái vấn đề này. Thì những cái giải pháp nó xuất phát từ những cái việc giống như là những cái công tác xã hội nhân sự, cũng giống như những cái công tác mang cái tính cách tư nhân, private, giống như là cái tổ chức của bác Nguyễn Đạt Thành hay là chính cô Nguyễn Thanh Thủy. Thì nó có nhiều phương cách khác mà chúng ta sẽ có thể tìm để giải quyết được những vấn đề này qua cái hình thức là chúng ta tiếp tục trao đổi với nhau và mở rộng cái tầm nhìn của chúng ta, mở rộng cái con tim của chúng ta để xem đây là những cái công việc mang tính chất nhân đạo và đạo đức. Thấy tóm tắt nó sơ sơ nhưng mà không biết đúng hay không. Xin cảm ơn quý vị nhé.